Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you guys a lightning fast mini lecture here on the concept of God and why it has had a compelling hold, I think, on human beings. It's just like a natural attractor to us. And why is that? What about it that we can identify? And I'll link that into what I think Swinburne's doing in this bit that I had you guys read for this week. I'm not putting any of this material on the quizzes, so use it if it's useful to you. I'm hoping this will be of some benefit. Okay, so here we go. Like I said, lightning fast. Why is God so attractive? So we have in our field now, at least in Western culture, the flying spaghetti monster objection. Richard Dawkins makes this objection. Lots of other people do too. What's so special about monotheism, the God of the Bible, the God of the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims and so forth? Why monotheism? There's thousands of gods and goddesses that people have made up over the years. You Christians are atheists about all of those. We atheists are atheists about just one more. And it's just a matter of luck that you happen to believe in the God you believe in, just like it was a matter of luck that people used to believe in Marduk or Thor or Athena or whoever. It's just where you grew up and that kind of thing. Why privilege God over the flying spaghetti monster, who's an imaginary god or deity that was made up back in the 1980s or 90s? What's so special about God? Why should he be better? Okay, so that's the challenge that's on the table. What do we say about that? Why indeed believe in God? The answer's been out there for a long, long time. The question itself betrays a failure to investigate the answer that's already available. The God idea is not at all like the ideas of the gods and goddesses of any of the mythologies of the world. It's fundamentally different, and it's known to be different. And the facts suggest this even to people who don't believe in God. If you just count Christians, Jews, and Muslims, monotheism, this idea of the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth, has found a place in the hearts and minds of well over 50% of the human race. And if you add in Sikhs and monotheistic Hindus, which is not the majority position, but it is a strong minority position, it's a bit more than 50%. In fact, I think we're already at 55%, and clearly by mid-21st century, we're going to be over 60%. So who knows where it's going to go from there. And I think an additional data point to make, whether you're talking to somebody who's a believer or not, is in the case of Christianity and Islam, these are stories of expansion into cultures that already had established religions and gods and goddesses. Islam expands into the Arab culture, which is a polytheistic culture, and it conquers that militarily, but also intellectually, and into Northern Africa, and eventually into India, and into lots of different parts of the world. Christianity expands into Rome and Greece and Syria for a long time until Islam drives it out, and into Western Europe, Northern Europe, into Russia. And these are places where pagan religions, polytheistic religions, were well established, well entrenched, had the force of politics and military behind them, and there was military clashes and political coercion involved, but that's not enough to account for why Christianity was so successful in those places. And I think at least part of the reason that it is there's an innate attractiveness to the God idea. It's more complex than that, but there is an innate attractiveness to this idea of the one true God. It's obvious from the facts that you can't just say, well, it's what you were raised with. Because clearly these are missionary religions. They converted a lot of people who were raised one way and ended up their lives believing something different. So it's not just childhood indoctrination plus the luck of the draw of where you were born. So, what is it about God? Why is the God idea such an attractive idea? Well, this is, again, I'm simplifying, but I think part of the idea is when we're talking about God, we're talking about this very strange, incomprehensible concept of the perfect being. And this perfect being idea crops up over and over again. Hindu theology, Hinduism, as far back as we know, has multiple gods and goddesses and powers and forces. And there's atheistic strains in ancient Hinduism and theistic strains in ancient Hinduism and monotheistic and polytheistic strains. But you do see this perfect being becoming part of what crops up, especially in the Vedic thought, that this idea that beyond all the gods and goddesses, beyond all the beings that we worship, and that the cult is oriented around, there must be this thing kind of beyond our comprehension, Brahman or beyond Brahman, that is the source of all. This is, often this is accompanied as a way to solve the first cause problem. Where did everything come from? And as a way to sort out polytheism. Why do we have all these gods? Well, they're actually a reflection of a much deeper unity that's back behind it all. So the Bhagavad Gita would be a classic example of this. The Bhagavad Gita is a polyvalent text. It has multiple meanings, and it's interpreted in multiple ways, and it actually, I think, varies from chapter to chapter how it should be interpreted. But it definitely invites, and in some chapters way more than others, it definitely invites this perfect being, monotheistic interpretation. Krishna just is the being that you and I are talking about, I think, when we talk about God in some of the passages. Just the source of all, beyond all of our understanding, dwelling in unapproachable light. I think all of those things a Hindu would understand if we talked about Krishna in those terms. Same thing is true for the good in Plato, in late-stage Plato, in the Republic dialogue, for instance. Again, the good is the source of all reality. It's where everything comes from. Everything real goes back to the good, the idea of the good, this immaterial value beyond all values. Everything else, all the other ideals in Plato's realm of the ideals, as well as everything in physical reality, all are reflections of and emanations from this one reality, the good. Everything comes from there. A whole set of lectures we can do to talk about how that was supposed to happen. But the point is, there was one source of all of this diversity. The Stoic critiques of popular religion, polytheistic religion in the Greek and Roman periods. Zeus comes to be described as almighty and all-powerful and all-wise in perfect being terms often. In him we live and move and have our being. The Stoics were not content. Now, there's all kinds of fights about whether the Stoics were pantheists or monotheists. And you can pick your quotes and, make your choice on what you think they were. But it sure looks like they're skirting this perfect being theology. The one in Neoplatonism, Plotinus, again, this being beyond all of our concepts. We can only speak about the one in negative terms. He's not this, he's not that. He's not divided, he's not conceptualized, he's not all of these things. But the solution to where does everything come from, the solution to why is anything valuable, the answer to why do we think there are all these multiple gods and goddesses that fight with each other, there's this unity behind this diversity, perfect being theories. This is all out there, and it kind of bears witness to the thesis I'm arguing, which is that the perfect being idea is a natural attractor for how human beings think. That gives rise to what we call classic theism, perfect being theology. Those pre-Christian critiques of late-stage polytheism, like Plato's, like Plotinus's, those really, the Christians take those on board a lot. And so God, once he kind of gets massaged through Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, ends up being, the biblical text seems to mesh pretty well with this perfect being theology. And that becomes by far the dominant view when you, once we get to Augustine certainly, and really before him, you've got this perfect being theology being articulated as the true picture of what the Bible says about God. God is that which is perfect in power, that which is perfect in goodness, that which is perfect without shadow of turning in all values. And so that's the solution to your first cause. But he is the creator of heaven and earth. Where did everything come from? God. What is everything for? Well, that question can only be answered in terms of what God wants it to do or wants it to be. Everything gets back to this. This is classical theism. And it is incredibly powerful. By the time you get to the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, this really deep connection between Platonic and Aristotelian thought and biblical thought, which gets reflected, I think, in Islam, in Muhammad's revelation. He's very, very deeply influenced by biblical religion, obviously. You've got the most influential thinkers in Judaism, people like Maimonides, some of the most influential thinkers in Islam. I'm thinking of Ibn Sina, but there were others. And of course, super influential thinkers like Anselm and Thomas Aquinas in Christian theology. And all of them are going deep, deep, deep into this perfect being theology, this classical theism viewpoint. Well, that is not even in the same category as gods like Zeus and Marduk and anything else that have been worshipped in the traditional polytheistic or mythological religions. One of the ways you can kind of tell whether you're dealing with perfect being theology versus a standard mythology is if you've got an origin story. That's kind of one of your ways of making the distinction. Beings that have origin stories aren't the perfect being. So Marduk, you know who his parents are and his grandparents are and his great-grandparents are. He gets to be the chief god, but he does that by right of combat against Tiamat. Zeus is the same. You know who his granddad is, and his dad. He has to fight his dad. He has to fight the other titans, and he gets also by combat. He gets to be in charge. Wotan has enemies that he has to negotiate and make promises to. That's how he's got an origin story. And how he gets to have the power that he has. So the origin story is kind of a dead giveaway that you're talking about the ordinary polytheistic type of gods. The perfect being theologies don't have origin stories because they can't. The whole point is you can't get to be perfect being if you're not already perfect being. You can't start from any finite point and kind of grow up to be perfect. You're either perfect or you're not. So the perfect being theologies are kind of the end of the line as far as where did that come from. That's kind of the way you can tell what you're dealing with. One of the things I hate about the natural-supernatural distinction is it makes God equal to Marduk, puts him in the same category. He's really not in the same category as Marduk and Casper the Friendly Ghost. Okay, so that's classical theism. What's Swinburne up to? Well, Swinburne he's a classical theist. I think he thinks most of those things about God. He has a temporal view of God, but other than that, he's pretty much like the classical theists. But he's given a unique argument based on the way science and confirmation theory in science work. And it particularly how we use simplicity in science. And it's simply this Occam's razor that many of you are familiar with. When all other factors are equal, the simpler theory is most likely to be true. We know, it's a well-known fact that any data set is insufficient to determine the correct theory. No matter how much data I gather, there are actually many, many theories that will fit that data. In fact, trivially, there are an infinite number of theories that can be artificially constructed to fit any particular data set that you have. I can get more data that'll eliminate an infinite number of theories as wrong. Now they no longer fit the data. But as Swinburne points out, we can add in, again, an infinite number of other theories that are all just as adequate to match the data. So how do we ever come to one theory that we really believe is true? And the answer is, we just pick the simplest one. And it doesn't seem like we are just saying, well, for convenience sake, let's pick simplest. It actually seems in our mind that the simplest one is the true one. That if it's simple, if it's elegant, it is true. And I leave it to you to imagine if that's right and to investigate that for yourselves. But I think you'll come to the same conclusion that Swinburne does. I certainly think that's correct. So if you buy that when all other factors are equal, the simpler theory is more likely to be true. Now, please don't forget that when all other factors are equal. Not all simple theories are valuable. That all the other factors have to be lined up as, they can't help us make a choice. So if there's a theory that is more complicated but it fits the data better, it's a better theory than a simpler one that doesn't fit the data. And if there's a theory that, lines up with other stuff we know and hooks into our other theories better, it maybe is a better theory than one that's simpler but doesn't line up with the other stuff we know. Okay, but other things being equal, the simpler theory is most likely to be true. Okay, then Swinburne does his analysis of what people are like. And you can do this several different ways, but all real or even imaginary people have very specific amounts of power, knowledge, and freedom, which require specific and often complex explanations. I'm Jim Barrett. I'm 63. No, maybe 64. Yeah, I'm 63. And I have a specific amount of knowledge because I've got a PhD and I've been studying a bunch of stuff. And I've got a specific amount of power. I am a professor, so I have power over you 6 that are listening to this right now. And so forth. But it is very specific. And in fact, there are particular factors that cause me to have just the amount of power I have and not more and not less. And fairly complex stories that have to be told if you wanted to pick out why I have exactly the amount of knowledge and freedom and power I have. Okay? Well, when we get to God, what we say about him is profoundly elegant and simple. We don't have an elaborate story to tell about how much power he has. We just say, there's no limit on his power. 0 limits. It is infinite. Well, but why? There's no more to be said. Infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite freedom, infinite goodness, infinite love, every quality that makes God better, greater, higher, nobler, he has that to the maximum degree. There's no limit. And what that means is God is a God of profound, is a person. The concept of God is the concept of a person of supreme simplicity. And this is different from the classical theistic view of the simplicity of God, but it's related to it. All Swinburne is arguing is that in terms of conceptual simplicity, God is a very, very simple idea. You can't have 0 amount of power and still be a person. You can't have 0 amount of knowledge and still be a person. So to be a person, you have to have some amount of those things. The next simplest amount, the flip side of 0, is infinity. And so Swinburne's arguing, God is the simplest person. All right, you think that through. If Swinburne is right, then that has a profound implication for some of the standard objections that we get to theistic arguments. And this is why, Swinburne's move is a nice move when dealing with skeptics about God. Suppose some piece of evidence gives us an inclination to believe there's some kind of designing intellect out there, or there's some kind of purposive force behind the universe. But, the skeptic will say, but how do we know it's God? Why not the flying spaghetti monster? Why not the gods and goddesses of Greece, or Northern Europe, or of ancient India, or Japan? Why God? Why not the gods? Why not? How do we know it's not a giant, supercomputer that's got us all making us think we're seeing design, and when we're really just seeing the program, or super intelligent aliens who are manipulating our universe, and so forth. All of these, if we need any kind of personal explanation, Swinburne's move sets us up to say the God hypothesis is the best hypothesis, other things being equal. If you don't have any other reason to favor God over the gods of ancient India, or super intelligent supercomputers, or anything like that, if you need some kind of personal explanation, and that's all you know, then you go for God, because it's the simplest and most elegant of all hypotheses. Well, that's a very interesting move. And that, of course, sets up his other Swinburne's other arguments. I really like that. I actually think there's something there. I think Swinburne has found an alternative way to tap into and give a more modern analysis of one of the things that's very attractive about classical theism, about perfect being theology. Now, please notice the caveat with simplicity is always other things being equal. You might have some extra evidence that favors the gods of India for some reason, or super intelligent aliens, or future universe simulators, or something like that. But if you don't, it's just, well, there has to be some kind of designer, or there has to be some kind of purposive intellect because of XYZ data. And that's all you've got? God's the best explanation, the most likely explanation, the one that's most likely to be true. It doesn't prove that God exists, but it raises the probability of God. God's the most likely of all your personal hypotheses that might be out there. Okay. And this has another nice feature. Swinburne, by doing this, has kind of tied belief in God, has shown how belief in God is akin to a very common move in science. Why do we believe that there's one uniform theory of gravity? Well, we've got a theory of gravity that works with all that we've been able to observe. We've never found an exception to it. Well, that doesn't tell us there's one theory of gravity. That tells us a range within which any set of theories of gravity would have to fit. But that's totally compatible with an infinite number of interlocking sets of gravitational theories, or variable sets of laws, as long as they vary underneath what we've observed. That's all totally compatible. We don't say that that's what's going on with gravity. We think this is the law. We go with the simplest formulation, and we say that's how gravity works. The simplest formulation that fits the data we have. Well, the perfect God hypothesis, the perfect being hypothesis, does the same thing if we need a personal explanation in any area. So, it's still open to a skeptic to object to that. Well, you've just tapped into a quirk of human personality. sure, we like simpler explanations. For one thing, it makes the math easier. The simpler you can make things. But that tells us nothing about reality. We don't know if reality is simple or not. And all of that's true, but it has a lethal side effect for naturalism. Because if you reject simplicity as a sign of truth, then you've messed up our theory of gravity and tons of other scientific theories as well. And a true, skeptic like a David Hume, he doesn't care. He's happy to chuck science too. But modern naturalism, somebody like a Richard Dawkins or a Daniel Dennett, they love science and they want to do everything they can to preserve the integrity of the scientific enterprise. So it's lethal for them to do anything that tears the ground out from under it. Getting rid of the simplicity argument, the ability to use simplicity as a sign of truth, that really rips the ground out from under science. So they can't just dismiss this as a psychological quirk. So I think we have a really nice way here to explain what's gone wrong with the flying spaghetti monster objection. We can say we're not dealing with just any old theory of God. We are dealing with this fantastically simple and compelling concept of God. This helps us to understand why this is so compelling, helps us to understand the data that shows that human beings find it quite compelling and powerful and satisfying in an intellectual way. So, anyway, that's what I have to say about what I think Swinburne's up to. Hope you guys enjoy reading. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.